Chapter 1, The Basement Office. Mark Fran liked to think of himself as adaptable. When Becky told him her mother was coming to stay for a while, he had nodded without hesitation, already standing, already mentally cataloging what would need to move. The office, obviously. It was the only room that made sense. The desk could go downstairs. He'd always meant to clean the basement anyway. It's temporary, Becky had said, voice tight in that way it had been since her father died. Just until Mom figures things out. Mark had kissed her temple and said, of course, because that was what a good husband did, because he meant it. A year later, the basement office smelled faintly of detergent and concrete, and the word temporary had stretched thin enough to see through. Mark sat at his desk, shoulders slightly hunched, laptop open to a spreadsheet he had already finished reviewing. Above him, the house made its familiar sounds, footsteps overhead, the muffled clatter of a cupboard, the faint rhythm of the washing machine. Normal sounds, except they all belonged to someone else now. He rolled his shoulders once and took a sip of coffee that had gone lukewarm without his noticing. He didn't resent Becky's mother, not really. Linda had always been kind to him before. Talkative. Opinionated, sure, but in the way that felt like personality, not judgment. When Becky's dad had died, quickly, cruelly, Linda had folded in on herself, and Mark had understood that too. Grief rearranged people. He'd read that somewhere. So he stepped up. More dinners. More school pickups. More bedtime routines. He learned which kid needed water after brushing teeth and which one needed it before or they'd cry about the toothpaste taste. He cleaned. He listened. He stayed out of the way. He thought he was helping. The comments started small. You know, Mark, most people rinse the sink after shaving. Oh, you missed a crumb there. Becky usually loads the dishwasher a little differently. He smiled through them, nodded, adjusted. Becky noticed once or twice and apologized immediately, whispering later that her mom didn't mean anything by it. I'll talk to her, Becky had promised, eyes shiny but determined. And she had. For a few days, things smoothed out. Linda went quiet in that careful way that suggested effort. Then the comments came back wearing new clothes. Well, I suppose that works for you. If that's how you like it. No, don't move. I'll just do it myself. Mark learned the geography of the house in avoidance patterns. Which rooms were safer at which times. How long he could stay in the kitchen before a sigh would appear behind him like punctuation. He told himself it was temporary. Grief, stress. This wasn't about him. But it felt like it was. So he stayed later at work. First, it was just finishing things properly. Then volunteering for an extra client. Then accepting side projects that paid well but took time. He framed it neatly when Becky asked. Just trying to get ahead, he said once, smiling. You know, for us. She smiled back, but her eyes searched his face like she was reading subtext he hadn't written down. Becky could always read him. That night, Mark sat in his car in the nearly empty office parking lot. Engine off, phone propped against the steering wheel. The glow from the screen lit his face in pale blue as a podcast droned on about productivity hacks he wasn't listening to. He sipped coffee and stared through the windshield, watching nothing. Inside the building, the lights were dark. Cleaning crews had already passed through. His email was caught up. There was nowhere he needed to be except home, and that was precisely the problem. He wasn't angry. That was what scared him. Anger would have been easier. Anger could be expressed and burned off. What he felt was pressure. The kind that built slowly and invisibly until something cracked. He imagined himself snapping, saying something sharp and irrevocable. Something Becky would hear and never unhear. He imagined the look on her face and felt his chest tighten. So he stayed parked. Across town, Becky stood in their kitchen holding 2 containers of leftovers, brow furrowed. He should be home by now, she said, mostly to herself. Linda, seated at the table, stirred her tea. Work is work, she said lightly. Some people don't mind it. Becky didn't respond. She put the containers into a bag and grabbed her keys. I'm going to bring him dinner, she said. Linda looked up, surprised. At this hour? Becky smiled, but it didn't quite land. He forgets to eat. The drive was quiet. Becky replayed conversations in her head, looking for clues she might have missed. Mark had been patient, steady, supportive to a fault. But lately there was something else, a carefulness, like he was bracing himself against an unseen edge. When she pulled into the office lot, her heart jumped. The building was dark. For one panic second, her mind leapt to every worst-case scenario it could invent. Then she exhaled and laughed quietly at herself. Of course the building was closed. Of course he'd still be nearby. She spotted his car tucked away at the far end, a faint glow inside. Becky parked a few spaces away and approached quietly, instinctively. She saw him through the window, shoulders slumped, phone in hand, eyes unfocused. He looked tired, not exhausted, worn, like something had been rubbing against him for too long. She opened the passenger door and slid in. The door closing sounded loud in the silence. Mark jumped, coffee sloshing dangerously. Jesus, Becky? She crossed her arms and looked at him. Not angry, confused, concerned. Explain, she said. The podcast kept talking. Mark stared at her, then reached forward and turned the phone off. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he exhaled, long and shaky, and rested his forehead against the steering wheel. I didn't want to ruin us, he said quietly. Chapter 2. Helpful is a moving target. I didn't want to ruin us. The words landed between them, heavy and quiet, like something fragile set carefully on a table. Becky didn't respond right away. She watched Mark straighten slowly from the steering wheel, watched the way his hand stayed on it a beat too long, knuckles pale, as if the wheel were the only solid thing left in reach. She had seen him tired before, newborn tired, deadline tired, flu season tired, but this was different. This was the tired of someone who had been bracing for impact that never quite came. Ruin us how? She asked gently. Mark swallowed. The parking lot lights hummed faintly. Somewhere far away, a car door slammed. Then silence returned, wide and unhelpful. I'm not mad, he said. That's the problem. I'm full. And I keep thinking if I open my mouth at the wrong moment, it's all gonna spill out in a way I can't clean up. Becky uncrossed her arms and turned fully toward him. Spill what? He gave a humorless huff of a laugh. Everything I'm not supposed to say. She waited. Becky had learned a long time ago that Mark needed space to find his words, but not so much space that he could retreat entirely. She stayed present, eyes on him, breathing steady. At home, he continued, choosing each word like it might be sharp. I feel like I'm always, almost wrong. Not wrong enough to argue with, just wrong enough to correct. Her chest tightened. She thought of her mother's voice, the way it had taken on an edge she didn't remember from childhood. She thought of the way grief had sharpened everything, made every inconvenience feel personal. She doesn't mean... Becky started, then stopped herself. She closed her eyes briefly. I know you know that. Mark nodded. I know, and I know why she's there. I know why you're the way you are right now. I don't blame anyone. He exhaled again. I don't feel like there's room for me to be anything but agreeable. The word hung there, uncomfortable. Becky reached out and rested her hand on his forearm. He flinched almost imperceptibly, then relaxed into the touch. Why didn't you tell me it was this bad? She asked. He looked at her, eyes tired but honest. Because you're already carrying so much. And because every time I started to say something, I pictured your dad. And then I pictured your mom alone in that house. And then I pictured you trying to hold all of it together. His mouth twisted. So I figured if I stayed out of the way, no one would get hurt. Becky stared at the dashboard, at a small crack she'd never noticed before. Out of the way. The phrase echoed unpleasantly. You don't get to disappear, she said quietly. Not from me. He nodded but didn't look convinced. They drove home together, the car filled with a cautious quiet that was different from before. Less avoidance, more aftermath. Becky watched the familiar streets pass and tried to organize her thoughts into something useful. She loved her mother. She loved her husband. She was so tired of feeling like loving one required shrinking the other. Inside the house, Linda was already in bed. The kids' doors were closed, their hallway nightlight casting a soft glow like a truce. Becky put the leftovers in the fridge and leaned back against the counter, rubbing her face. Mark hovered, unsure whether to speak or vanish. Sit, she said, pointing to the table. He obeyed, folding himself into the chair like he wasn't sure he was allowed to take up space. I need you to tell me specifics, Becky said, pulling out the opposite chair. Not to build a case, just so I understand. Mark hesitated. You sure? Yes. He thought for a moment, then nodded. Okay. Yesterday morning, I was packing lunches. I used the last of the bread without realizing it. Becky winced. I remember that. Your mom said, I suppose we'll just have to make do, and then went out and bought more bread, which is fine. Except she bought a different kind and told the kids they'd have to eat that now because we can't all be careless. Becky closed her eyes. That one had slipped past her, filed under everyone's tired. And tonight, Mark continued, quieter now, I put the clean towels in the linen closet. She took them out and refolded them in front of me. Didn't say anything. Just sighed. Becky exhaled sharply. Okay. And those things alone? I can handle those. It's just that it's constant. And I never know which version I'm getting. The friendly one or the one that makes me feel like a guest who's overstayed. The word guest landed hard. I'm sorry, Becky said. I should have seen it sooner. I didn't want you to feel like you had to choose, Mark said quickly. I still don't. I'm not choosing, she said, more firmly than she intended. She softened her tone. I'm setting boundaries. There's a difference. He studied her face, searching for certainty. Are you sure you're ready for that? Becky let out a small, humorless laugh. Ready or not, I don't get to let my husband feel homeless. The next morning, Mark left early for work, partly out of habit, partly because he needed the space to let the conversation settle. Becky stayed home, the house quiet after the kids left for school. Linda was in the living room watching the news with the volume low. Morning, Becky said. Morning, sweetheart, Linda replied, smiling. The smile was genuine. That was the hardest part. Becky sat down across from her mother, hands folded. She felt like she was about to step onto thin ice, but she stepped anyway. "Mom," she began. "We need to talk about Mark." Linda's smile faltered just slightly. "What about him?" "He's trying very hard," Becky said carefully. "And I think sometimes it feels like what he does is never quite right." Linda's lips pressed together. "I don't criticize him." Becky nodded. "I know you don't think you do, but intention and impact aren't always the same." Linda bristled. "I'm grieving, Becky." "I know," Becky said, voice steady but soft. "And I love you, but so is he in his own way. And I can't let this house become a place where he feels unwelcome." Silence stretched. The television murmured about traffic somewhere else, in someone else's life. "I lost my husband," Linda said finally, voice trembling. "Everything feels out of control." Becky reached for her hand. "I know, but Mark isn't the enemy, and neither are you. We just need to stop hurting each other by accident." Linda looked away, eyes shiny. "I'll try," she said. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. That evening, Mark came home on time. He paused in the driveway, surprised to see Becky's car already there. Inside, the house felt tentative, like everyone was walking on freshly mopped floors. At dinner, Linda asked Mark about work. He answered cautiously. She nodded without comment. Afterward, as Mark loaded the dishwasher, Linda hovered, then stopped herself. She cleared her throat and went into the living room instead. Mark froze, then continued. Later, in the basement, he told Becky about it. "She almost said something," he said. "Then she didn't." Becky smiled tiredly. "Progress." He smiled back, small but real. It wasn't fixed. They both knew that. Helpful, Mark was learning, was a moving target, defined by whoever felt most unsteady at the moment. But that night, when Mark went upstairs instead of hiding in the basement office, when Becky leaned into him on the couch and laughed quietly at a dumb commercial, the house felt a little less crowded. And for the first time in weeks, Mark didn't feel like he had to stay late to earn his place in it. Chapter 3, Staying Late. Mark told himself it was temporary. That was the phrase he used when he agreed to move his desk to the basement. It was the phrase he used when Linda's boxes didn't get unpacked right away. It was the phrase he used now as he checked the time, 7:46 p.m., and decided it made more sense to stay until 8 than to go home and interrupt whatever fragile equilibrium might currently be in place. Temporary had become elastic. It stretched to fit whatever he needed it to mean. He stared at his computer screen, rereading the same paragraph of an email without absorbing it. The office around him had thinned out over the last hour, cubicles emptying, lights clicking off in clusters. The late stayers were a predictable group. The overachievers, the newly divorced, the people who hated their roommates. Mark used to leave before most of them. Now he nodded at them like a regular. "You heading out soon?" Dave from accounting asked, passing by with his jacket slung over one shoulder. "In a bit," Mark said automatically. Dave raised an eyebrow. "You've been saying that a lot lately." Mark smiled, practiced and easy. "Busy season." Dave snorted. "Isn't it always?" When Dave left, Mark leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. The office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and copier toner. It was quiet in a way that felt earned. No one here corrected how he stacked papers or sighed at the way he rinsed a mug. The expectations were clear. Do the work. Do it well. Go home. He stayed until 8:30 anyway. At home, Becky sat on the edge of their bed, folding laundry into neat piles. She paused every so often to glance at her phone, then scolded herself for it and folded faster. The kids were already asleep, worn out from a day that had included spelling tests and a minor meltdown over mismatched socks. Linda hovered in the doorway. "He's working late again?" she asked. "Yes," Becky said, keeping her tone neutral. Linda clicked her tongue softly. "Men these days, always chasing something." Becky looked up. "Mom, I'm just saying," Linda continued, stepping into the room uninvited. "Your father was home every night at 6. Dinner on the table by 6:30. That's how families stay connected." Becky folded a shirt with more force than necessary. Dad also worked 10 minutes away and lived in a completely different economy. Linda waved a hand. "Excuses." Becky stood. "Mark isn't abandoning us. He's working." Linda looked at her, startled by the sharpness. "I didn't say he was abandoning you." "No," Becky said. "But you implied it." Silence settled, uncomfortable and brittle. Linda pursed her lips. "I worry about you." "I know," Becky said, softer now. "But worrying about me by criticizing my husband isn't helpful." Linda's eyes filled, just a little. "Everything feels wrong without your father." Becky's anger evaporated, replaced by guilt so familiar it felt like furniture. She stepped forward and hugged her mother, who stiffened, then sagged into it. "I know," Becky murmured. "I miss him too." When Mark finally came home, the house was dark except for the kitchen light. Becky was waiting, sitting at the table with a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. "You didn't text," she said. Not accusing, just stating a fact. "Sorry," Mark said, setting his bag down. "Lost track of time." She studied his face, the the faint crease between his eyebrows that had deepened over the past few months. Are you okay? He hesitated. The truth hovered, complicated and inconvenient. I'm fine, he said instead. Just tired. Becky nodded, but her eyes lingered on him like she was bookmarking the moment for later. The pattern repeated over the next week. Mark stayed late. Becky noticed. Linda commented. The kids adapted with the casual resilience of children who assumed adults always knew what they were doing. One night, as Mark pulled into the driveway earlier than usual, he sat in the car for a moment, engine running. He could see Becky through the window, moving around the kitchen, her hair pulled up in a messy bun he loved. Linda was at the table, gesturing animatedly, a tea towel draped over her shoulder like a prop. Mark turned the engine off and went inside. Daddy, his youngest called, running from the hallway and colliding with his legs. Mark scooped him up automatically. Hey, buddy. You're home early, Becky said, surprised and pleased. Thought I'd shake things up, Mark replied, smiling. Linda looked up. Oh, you're here. There it was. Not rude, not kind, just noted. Dinner was fine. Not tense exactly, but careful. Mark laughed at the right moments, asked about school projects, listened to Linda recount a story about the neighbor back home for the third time this month. Afterward, he stood to clear the table. I'll get it, Linda said quickly, already reaching for a plate. I've got it, Mark replied, keeping his voice even. Linda hesitated, then withdrew her hand. If you insist. He loaded the dishwasher. He did it the way he always did. He waited for the comment. Came eventually. You know, Linda said from behind him. If you angle the plates a bit more, they dry better. Mark closed his eyes briefly. Mom, Becky said, sharper than intended. Linda bristled. I'm just trying to help. Mark turned around slowly. His heart was pounding, not with anger, but with effort. Effort not to say the thing that had been sitting behind his teeth all day. I appreciate that, he said carefully. But I've got this. Linda sniffed. Fine. She left the kitchen, shoulders stiff. Mark leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. I'm sorry, Becky whispered, coming up beside him. He shook his head. It's not your fault. It feels like it is, she admitted. That night, Mark stayed awake long after Becky fell asleep, staring at the ceiling. He thought about work, about home, about the strange limbo he seemed to be living in, too present to disappear, too absent to belong. The next day, he volunteered for a Saturday project without thinking. On Saturday morning, Becky watched him pack his bag, movements efficient, almost relieved. You don't have to do this, she said. I know, he replied. But it helps. Helps what? He paused, then shrugged. Everything. She let him go, but the unease followed her all day. That evening, Becky sat alone on the couch, the house quiet in a way that felt wrong. Linda was in her room. The kids were asleep. Mark was somewhere else, choosing fluorescent lights over this. Becky picked up her phone and opened her messages, scrolling back through old photos, family vacations, silly selfies. Mark asleep on the couch with a kid sprawled across his chest. He had always been here, present, steady. She set the phone down and stared at the darkened hallway. Something was slipping. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, just enough to matter. And Mark, sitting at his desk under humming lights, felt it too, even as he told himself, again, that it was temporary. Chapter 4, the passenger seat. The silence after Mark's confession had weight to it. I didn't want to ruin us, he'd said, forehead pressed to the steering wheel, voice thin with restraint. Now he lifted his head and looked at Becky as if bracing for impact, like the truth itself might push her away. Becky didn't move. She didn't fill the quiet with reassurance or panic or tears. She simply stayed, breathing, letting the moment stretch until it could hold both of them. Okay, she said at last. Mark blinked. Okay. Yes, she said, nodding once. Okay, you're not ruining us. You're telling me something I needed to hear. He frowned, uncertain. You don't look relieved. I'm not, she admitted. I'm focused. She turned in her seat to face him fully, one knee tucked under her, the bag of food resting forgotten at her feet. Start at the beginning, she said. Not the polite version, the real one. Mark hesitated. He had already crossed a line by saying as much as he had. Going further felt dangerous, but he had also already learned that holding back was its own kind of risk. The real beginning, he said slowly, is that I thought if I just absorbed enough, eventually it would stop. Absorbed what? The comments, the corrections, the constant reminder that I'm doing things wrong without being told outright that I am. Becky winced. My mom. Yes, he said gently, but also me, because I let it happen without saying anything. I told myself it was kindness, or patience, or love. And now it feels like if one more, I'll just do it myself lands the wrong way, I'm gonna say something ugly. Something that doesn't sound like me. Something you'll never forget. Becky stared at him, heart pounding. You think I don't notice? I think you notice everything, Mark said, which is why I didn't want to add this to your pile. My pile, she repeated softly. She looked away, out at the empty lot, the closed building, the absurdity of this conversation happening in a parked car under flickering lights. You know what my pile feels like? She asked. It feels like I'm failing everyone at once. Mark shook his head. You're not. I know, she interrupted. Logically, but emotionally. I'm the bridge between you and my mom, between my grief and hers, between what this house was and what it is now. She swallowed. And bridges get walked on. Mark reached for her hand, tentative. She let him take it. I don't want you to disappear, Becky continued. I don't want you hiding in parking lots and fluorescent offices because home feels unsafe. He squeezed her hand. I didn't think of it as unsafe. What did you think of it as? He considered. Loud. Even when no one was talking. That landed. Becky nodded slowly. Okay, then here's what we're going to do. Mark looked at her, surprised. We. Yes, we, she said firmly. Because I won't fix this alone, and you won't fix it by vanishing. She held up a finger. First, you stop lying to me about work. I wasn't lying, he protested weakly. You were curating, she corrected. And I get why, but it stops now. He nodded. Okay. Second, she continued. We stop pretending this is temporary if it's not. Temporary has turned into a loophole. He let out a short breath. That's accurate. And third, Becky said, voice steady now. I talked to my mom again. Not carefully. Not vaguely. Clearly. Mark hesitated. I don't want to make things worse. You're not, she said. I am. He searched her face. Are you sure you're ready for that? No, she said honestly. But I'm more ready than I am to lose you to a car. That made him smile despite himself. You make it sound like I'm having an affair with my parking spot. She snorted. At least then I'd know what I was competing with. The tension eased, just a notch. Enough to breathe. They drove home together, windows down, the cool night air cutting through the heaviness. Becky talked about the kids, about a stupid thing that had happened at the grocery store, about nothing and everything. Mark listened, grateful for the normalcy of it, for the sound of her voice filling the car instead of his thoughts. At home, the house was quiet. Linda's door was closed. The kids' nightlight glowed faintly at the end of the hall. Becky set the food in the fridge and turned to Mark. Come sit with me. They sat on the couch, close but not touching, the space between them charged with things unsaid. I hate that my mom makes you feel unwelcome, Becky said finally. It makes me feel like I've failed as a wife. Mark shook his head immediately. No, don't do that. I know, she said. But feelings don't follow rules. He smiled sadly. Tell me about it. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes. Then Becky stood. I'm talking to her tomorrow, she said. Okay. And tonight, she added. You're not allowed to stay up late worrying. He raised an eyebrow. You're imposing a bedtime? I am, she said. Marriage perk. He laughed quietly. Yes, ma'am. They went upstairs together. Becky changed into pajamas while Mark brushed his teeth, the mundane rituals grounding in their familiarity. When they slid into bed, Becky turned toward him immediately, tucking herself into his chest like muscle memory. I miss you, she said quietly. I'm right here, he replied, kissing her hair. I know, she said. That's why I'm saying it. The next morning, Becky found her mother in the kitchen, already dressed, already alert. Mom, Becky said, can we talk? Linda stiffened slightly. About what? About Mark, and about the house, and about what happens next. Linda sighed and sat down. I was hoping we wouldn't have to. Becky pulled out a chair and sat too. So was I. But hoping isn't working. Linda folded her hands. I don't mean to be critical. I know, Becky said. But intent doesn't erase impact. Linda flinched. He told you. Yes, Becky said. And I'm glad he did. Linda looked away. I feel like everything I knew how to be, a wife, a partner, just disappeared. So I notice things, control things. I get that, Becky said. But you're controlling him out of the house. That got Linda's attention. I don't want that, she said quickly. Then we need boundaries, Becky replied. Clear ones. Linda swallowed. Like what? Like letting him do things his way. Like speaking directly instead of sighing. Like remembering that this is his home too. Silence stretched. Finally, Linda nodded. I can try. That's all I'm asking, Becky said. That evening, Mark came home on time. He hesitated at the door, listening. The house sounded normal. At dinner, Linda passed him a plate without comment. Later, when he loaded the dishwasher, she stayed seated. As he went upstairs, Becky caught his eye and smiled. It wasn't solved, but it was shifting. And that night, Mark slept without dreaming of parking lots. Chapter 5, the conversation they've been avoiding. The house did not explode. That was the first thing Mark noticed when he came home the evening after Becky talked to her mother again. No slammed doors. No icy silence. No passive-aggressive rearranging of the spice rack. The house simply existed. He paused just inside the entryway, keys still in his hand, listening. From the kitchen came the low murmur of voices, Becky and Linda, talking. Not arguing, talking. There was even a laugh, short and surprised, like someone had stumbled into humor without meaning to. Mark set his bag down slowly, like a man entering a wildlife preserve. "Hey!" Becky called when she noticed him. "You're home. On time," he said, raising his voice just enough to sound casual. Linda turned from the counter. "Good evening, Mark." Her tone was neutral, not warm, not sharp, just normal. "Evening," he replied. They ate dinner together. It was spaghetti, nothing fancy, nothing loaded with symbolism. The kids talked over each other. Becky reminded them to chew. Linda listened more than she spoke. When Mark reached for the Parmesan, Linda didn't correct his grip or suggest he was shaking it wrong. Mark noticed everything. After dinner, Becky stood and stretched. "Okay, kids, homework check." As the children scattered, Linda gathered her plate. Mark stood at the same time. "I'll get it," he said. Linda hesitated. Mark saw it, the moment of instinct fighting habit, then nodded. "All right." She sat back down. Mark loaded the dishwasher. He waited. Nothing came. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt cautious, like someone walking across ice that had cracked before. Later that night, Becky found him in the basement office, sitting at his desk but not working. He was staring at the wall, hands folded loosely in his lap. "Hey," she said softly. He looked up. "Hey." She leaned against the doorframe. "You okay?" "I think so," he said. "I just don't know what okay looks like yet." She smiled faintly. "Fair." She came over and perched on the corner of the desk. "I talked to her." "I figured," he said. "She didn't critique my pasta twirling." Becky laughed. "High praise." Mark watched her, really watched her. The tired curve of her shoulders, the way her smile flickered between relief and something heavier. "How did it go?" he asked. Becky exhaled. "Hard. Emotional. Messy." She cried. I cried. "At one point she accused me of choosing you over her." "Which, oof," Mark said. "Which I didn't deny," Becky finished. "I reframed it." Mark's eyebrows lifted. "Reframed how?" "I told her I chose my marriage with her in my life, not instead of her," Becky said. "And that if those two things couldn't coexist, then something had to change." Mark sat back, absorbing that. "That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," she admitted. "But neither is watching you disappear." He reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. "Thank you." She squeezed back. "Don't thank me yet. This isn't over." "No," he agreed. "But it's different." The next few days confirmed that. Different didn't mean perfect. Linda still corrected the kids. She still hovered sometimes. But when she caught herself, she stopped. When she did comment, she said it plainly instead of letting it drip with implication. Progress, Becky called it. Mark called it manageable. The comedy of it all emerged in unexpected places. On Wednesday morning, Linda stood in the kitchen watching Mark make coffee. "You use a lot of grounds," she said. Mark froze. Linda blinked, then waved a hand. "Not wrong. Just strong." Mark waited. She shrugged. "To each their own." He poured the coffee and smiled into his mug. That afternoon, Becky found her mother standing in the hallway outside the basement door. "Mom." Linda jumped slightly. "I was just wondering if Mark needed the light turned off down there." Becky raised an eyebrow. "He's working." Linda nodded. "Right. Of course." She walked away, hands clasped behind her back like a woman resisting a strong urge. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Becky and Mark sat on the couch, feet tangled together. A dumb sitcom played quietly in the background. "This feels weird," Mark said. "Good weird or bad weird?" Becky asked. "Both," he replied. "Like when a noise stops and you realize how loud it was." Becky leaned her head against his shoulder. "I hate that you felt like you had to leave to keep the peace." "I didn't feel heroic about it," Mark said. "Mostly I felt like I was failing at something I didn't know how to do." She tilted her head up to look at him. "You didn't fail." "I avoided," he corrected. She nodded. "We both did." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Becky sighed. "There's something else," she said. Mark tensed slightly. "Okay. My mom doesn't want to stay forever," Becky continued. "She's just scared of what comes next." He relaxed. "That makes sense. She's been talking about maybe getting a small apartment nearby, or moving closer to my sister." Mark didn't respond immediately. He didn't want to sound eager. He also didn't want to lie. "How do you feel about that?" Becky asked. "I feel," he chose his words carefully, "relieved, and guilty about feeling relieved." Becky smiled softly. "Same." That weekend, the four of them, 5 if you counted the dog, went to a local festival. It was chaotic and loud and full of food trucks and music. Linda complained about the noise but smiled when the kids dragged her toward a booth selling handmade bracelets. Mark watched Becky with her mother. The way Becky hovered protectively without smothering. The way Linda leaned into her daughter even as she asserted her own opinions. They looked like two women renegotiating their roles. At one point, Mark hung back with a lemonade, watching them. Becky turned and caught his eye. She walked back to him. You okay? He nodded. Yeah, I was just thinking. This is what I was afraid of ruining. She slid her hand into his. You didn't ruin it. No, he agreed. But I could have if I'd kept quiet too long. Becky squeezed his hand. We're not good at pretending forever. Speak for yourself, he said dryly. I pretended I liked your aunt's tuna casserole for 3 years. She laughed. You loved that casserole. I loved you, he corrected. Later that night, after everyone was home and the house had settled, Linda knocked on their bedroom door. Becky sat up, startled. Mark reached for her hand instinctively. Yes, Becky called. Linda stepped in, hesitant. I just wanted to say, I'm trying. I know I don't always get it right. Becky softened immediately. I know, Mom. Linda turned to Mark. And I'm sorry if I made you feel unwelcome. Mark stood. Thank you for saying that. She nodded, eyes shiny. This house isn't the same without your father, she said to Becky. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't still feel like home. Becky swallowed. We'll figure it out. Linda left, closing the door gently behind her. Mark exhaled. Well, Becky echoed. They lay back down together, the bed familiar and solid beneath them. I'm glad you told me, Becky said quietly. So am I, Mark replied. He didn't say I'm glad you found me in the car, but it hovered there between them. Understood. As he drifted toward sleep, Mark realized something surprising. For the first time in months, he hadn't thought about work once that evening, and the parking lot felt very far away. Chapter 6, Temporary Solutions. Temporary solutions had a way of pretending they were permanent if no one watched them closely. Mark realized this on a Tuesday morning when he stood in the kitchen holding a travel mug, watching Linda carefully not rearrange the counter behind him. She hovered, hands clasped, eyes flicking from the coffee maker to the sink and back again like she was resisting an itch. Everything okay? He asked genuinely. Linda startled. Yes, of course. Why wouldn't it be? No reason, Mark said, then added lightly. You look like you're trying not to alphabetize my cabinets. Her mouth twitched despite herself. You keep your mugs upside down, so they don't collect dust. They're used every day. Still, he said, smiling, habit. Linda huffed. Temporary, she muttered. Mark paused. What's temporary? She waved a hand vaguely. All of this. Me. Here. He nodded slowly. That's fair. They stood in a quiet truce, the coffee maker gurgling between them like a mediator. The new rules, spoken and unspoken, worked most days. Becky had laid them out gently but clearly. No correcting unless asked, no sighing as commentary, no triangulating through the kids. Linda followed them the way someone follows a diet, mostly with lapses when stressed. Mark did his part too. He spoke up sooner, but without the pressure cooker buildup that had driven him to parking lots. When something bothered him, he named it calmly. Sometimes his voice shook anyway. The first time he did it, he surprised himself. Linda had commented, mildly, almost unconsciously, on the way he folded a fitted sheet. Mark felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct to swallow it and move on. Instead, he said, Hey, that one's not a suggestion I need. Linda blinked. Becky froze mid-step. Oh, Linda said. I'm sorry. And that was it. Mark retreated to the basement afterward, heart racing like he'd just run a mile. Becky followed him down a few minutes later. You okay? She asked. I think I just rewired something, he said, sitting on the edge of his desk. She smiled. Proud of you. He laughed, shaky. I feel like I just told off a bear. You lived, she said. Important milestone. Not everything went smoothly. On Thursday, Becky came home to find Linda reorganizing the pantry with intense focus. Mom, Becky said carefully. What are you doing? Linda didn't look up. Making it more efficient. Becky glanced at the floor, where cans and boxes were spread out like evidence. Did Mark ask for this? Linda paused. No. Then stop, Becky said, not unkindly but firmly. Linda straightened, affronted. I'm trying to help. I know, Becky replied. But helping without being asked is still control. Linda's shoulders sagged. I don't know what to do with my hands. Becky softened immediately. She stepped closer. Then sit with me. Tell me about Dad. Or tell me about literally anything else. Linda sniffed, eyes glossy. He hated when I rearranged things. Becky smiled faintly. Then he would have hated this. Linda laughed through her tears. They sat on the floor together, the pantry half finished, the moment imperfect and human. Mark came home later to find them there. Should I be worried? He asked. Becky shook her head. Only if you're attached to the idea of finding the peanut butter quickly. He grinned. I've survived worse. That night, after everyone went to bed, Mark and Becky sat in the living room, legs tangled, the house humming softly around them. This is harder than I thought, Mark admitted. Same, Becky said. Turns out boundaries don't install themselves. He leaned his head back against the couch. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Becky turned to him. What shoe? The one where this all falls apart and we pretend we didn't see it coming. She considered that. I don't think it's a shoe. I think it's maintenance. He frowned. Maintenance? Like a car, she said. You don't wait until it breaks down on the highway. You check the oil. You rotate the tires. You talk about weird noises before smoke comes out. He smiled. You're comparing our marriage to a Honda. A very reliable Honda, she corrected. With occasional warning lights. Mark laughed quietly. I like that better than the parking lot metaphor. She nudged him. Good. Because I'm confiscating your car keys emotionally. The weekend brought a test they hadn't anticipated. Linda announced over breakfast that she had found a potential apartment online. Becky's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Mark's coffee stopped just short of a sip. Already? Becky asked. Linda nodded. Just looking. It's small. Close to the bus line. That's fast, Becky said carefully. I don't want to overstay, Linda replied, eyes flicking briefly to Mark, then away. I can tell when I'm too much. Mark felt a twist of guilt, sharp and immediate. That's not, he started. Becky put a hand on his arm. Mom, you're not being pushed out. Linda smiled thinly. I know, but I don't want to be the reason you're all walking on eggshells. Mark set his mug down. You're not the reason. The situation is. Linda studied him, surprised. You don't resent me? He hesitated, then chose honesty. I resent how hard it's been sometimes, but not you. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. That's fair. They spent the afternoon looking at listings together, awkward but collaborative. The kids chimed in with opinions no one had asked for. Becky pointed out practicalities. Mark asked about storage and light and proximity to decent coffee. Linda noticed. You're being very involved, she said at one point. Mark shrugged. You're still family. Her eyes softened. Thank you. Later, when Becky and Mark were alone, she leaned against him and sighed. This feels like a win and a loss at the same time, she said. That sounds about right, he replied. The comedy returned in small bursts. Linda tried online dating, then declared it an apocalypse of men holding fish. Mark offered to help cure it. Becky confiscated both their phones. Mark attempted to reclaim the basement office fully, only to discover the Wi-Fi was unreliable, and the old chair squeaked loudly whenever he leaned back. It's like the house is testing me, he said, wrestling with a cable. Becky stood at the bottom of the stairs, arms crossed, amused. The house wants you upstairs. Tell the house to mind its business. One evening, Linda knocked on the basement door. Yes, Mark called. I just wanted to say, she said, hovering in the doorway. You're welcome to move your desk back upstairs when I leave. He smiled. Thanks, but I might keep part of it down here. She raised an eyebrow. Really? Yeah, he said. Turns out I like having a place to hide occasionally. By choice. She nodded, understanding something unspoken. Choice matters. It does, he agreed. That night, Becky found Mark asleep on the couch, one arm draped over the back, a kid's blanket half covering him. She smiled and snapped a quiet picture, saving it without a caption. When he woke later and joined her upstairs, he slid into bed and pulled her close. You okay? She murmured. Yeah, he said. I think we're doing it. Doing what? Not fixing things, he said. Just living through them. She smiled into his chest. That might be the best version. The house wasn't healed. It was adjusting, breathing differently, and for the first time, Mark felt like he was inside that breath instead of holding it. Chapter 7. The house breathes again. The house began to change in ways Mark didn't notice all at once. It wasn't dramatic. No furniture moved overnight. No declarations were made. But the air shifted, subtly, like a window cracked open somewhere upstairs. It started with sound. Mark realized one morning, halfway through pouring coffee, that he could hear Becky humming. Not the distracted kind she did when she was multitasking, but a soft, tuneless hum she used when she felt unobserved and unburdened. He froze, coffee mid-pour, afraid the awareness itself might stop it. Didn't. Linda sat at the table reading the paper, glasses perched low on her nose. She glanced up at Mark. You're going to overflow that, she said. Mark looked down. Right. Thank you. She nodded and went back to reading. No sigh. No commentary about attentiveness. Just information delivered and done. Mark felt something loosen in his chest. The kids noticed it too in their own way. Grandma doesn't yell at the dishwasher anymore. The older one observed one afternoon, as if remarking on the weather. She never yelled at it, Becky said. She judged it, the kid replied solemnly. Mark snorted before he could stop himself. Linda looked over. Excuse me? Nothing, Mark said quickly. Carry on judging silently. Linda gave him a look, half affronted, half amused, and shook her head. You're all impossible. But she was smiling. The apartment search continued, slowly, deliberately. Linda toured a few places, rejecting them for reasons that were sometimes practical and sometimes emotional. Too quiet, she said of one. Too close to traffic, of another. This one smells like someone else's life, she said flatly, closing the listing. Becky didn't push. Mark didn't rush. They learned, gradually, that patience felt different when it wasn't one-sided. One evening, Linda returned from a viewing and sat heavily at the kitchen table. I don't think I'm ready yet, she said. Becky tensed instinctively, then forced herself to relax. Okay. Mark waited. Linda looked between them. But I don't want to stay like this forever either. Mark nodded. That makes sense. I was thinking, Linda continued, tentative, maybe I go stay with your sister for a few weeks, just to see how it feels. Becky blinked. Really? Linda shrugged. She keeps asking. And it might be good for all of us to miss each other. Mark hid his relief behind a sip of water. Becky reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. I think that's a good idea. The night before Linda left, the house felt strange. Like a hotel room on checkout day, everything slightly off-kilter. Linda packed carefully, folding clothes the way she always had. Becky hovered in the doorway, unsure whether to help or stay out of the way. Mark busied himself with the kids, who oscillated between excitement and melancholy. Will Grandma forget us? The youngest asked seriously. No, Mark said. She'll call. Probably too much. Linda snorted from the hallway. I heard that. That evening, after the kids were asleep, the three of them sat at the table with mugs of tea. The conversation drifted, touching old memories, shared jokes, things unsaid but understood. I know this wasn't easy, Linda said finally, looking at Mark. Living with me. Mark met her gaze. It wasn't. But I'm glad we did. She studied him, then nodded. You're a good man. He smiled, surprised by how much that meant. When Linda left the next morning, the house felt larger immediately. Too quiet. Becky stood at the window, watching her mother's car disappear down the street. Mark came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. You okay? He asked. She leaned back into him. I think so. Ask me again tonight. The day unfolded gently. Mark worked from home. Upstairs at the old desk he'd moved back the night before. The chair didn't squeak. The window let in more light than he remembered. Becky moved through the house with a tentative freedom, like someone testing out a new rhythm. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Becky and Mark sat on the couch with takeout containers balanced precariously between them. This feels weird, Becky said again. Mark smiled. Good weird or bad weird? She laughed softly. Both. They ate in companionable silence, the television playing something neither of them was watching. Do you think we handled it right? Becky asked suddenly. Mark didn't answer immediately. He thought about the parking lot, the basement, the careful conversations, the nights they'd almost missed each other. I think we handled it honestly, he said. And I think that counts for more. She nodded, satisfied with that. Later, as they got ready for bed, Becky caught her reflection in the mirror and paused. What? Mark asked, noticing. She smiled, a little sheepish. I forgot what it feels like when the house doesn't need me every second. He stepped up behind her, resting his chin on her shoulder. You don't have to earn rest. She met his eyes in the mirror. Neither do you. That night, the house settled into a new quiet. Not empty, not tense, just open. Mark lay awake for a while, listening to it. He didn't feel like leaving. Chapter 8. Still married, still choosing. The first thing Becky noticed, a week after her mother left, was that Mark started parking in the driveway again. It was a small thing, barely worth mentioning. But she noticed it the way you noticed the return of a familiar habit you hadn't realized you'd been missing. His car where it belonged. No lingering in the street. No unnecessary laps around the block. He came inside lighter too. Not buoyant, exactly, but unburdened. Like someone who had set something down and was still surprised his hands were free. One evening, as they stood side by side brushing their teeth, Becky caught his eye in the mirror. You seem different, she said. Mark spat and rinsed. Good different or bad different? She smiled. Settled different. He considered that. I think I remembered that this is my house. She laughed quietly. Bold claim. I know, he said. But I've got tenure now. They went to bed without collapsing into sleep immediately, which felt like a small luxury they'd forgotten they were allowed. Becky lay on her side, facing him, tracing absent shapes on his arm. I keep replaying that night in the parking lot, she said. Mark winced. I'm sorry. No, she said quickly. Not like that. I mean, I keep thinking about how close we were to missing each other. He nodded. I was already practicing how to be absent. She swallowed. I hate that. So do I, he said. I thought I was protecting us. And you were, she said. Just sideways. They lay there, the house quiet around them. Not the brittle quiet from before, but the soft kind that felt earned. The days settled into a new rhythm. Mark worked reasonable hours. Not strictly 9 to 5, life was messier than that. But he came home because he wanted to, not because he'd calculated it was time. Becky stopped hovering, stopped scanning his face for signs of retreat. They talked more. Not just logistics or crisis management, but small things, observations, jokes that went nowhere. One night, as they folded laundry together, Mark held up a sock. "Why do all of these socks look the same but feel different?" he asked. Becky squinted. "That one's definitely softer. They're from the same pack. Then one of them has lived a better life." He laughed. "That's unfair. We bought them together." "Some socks are just luckier," she said solemnly. He tossed it at her head. They made time for each other in ways that weren't dramatic. A walk after dinner, coffee together before the kids woke up, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, feet touching, doing entirely separate things but choosing proximity anyway. One Saturday morning, Mark found Becky sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. "What's wrong?" he asked. She hesitated. "My mom sent me a listing." He stiffened slightly, then relaxed. "How do you feel about that?" "Torn," she admitted. "Relieved that she's thinking ahead. Sad that she's not here." Mark nodded. "Both can be true." She smiled at him. "You're very wise lately. I've had a lot of practice not saying the wrong thing." She reached for his hand. "You don't have to be careful with me." "I know," he said. "I'm learning the difference between careful and quiet." That afternoon, they took the kids to the park. Mark sat on the bench with Becky, watching them play. "You know," Becky said casually, "we should probably talk about the basement." Mark glanced at her. "The basement?" "My office," she clarified. "Your office. The room formerly known as my mom's room." He smiled. "Ah, that basement. I'm not kicking you out of it," she added quickly. "I know. I don't want you to feel like you have to hide down there." He thought about it. "I don't. Not anymore." She tilted her head. "Then why keep it?" "Because sometimes," he said, "I like choosing to be alone, instead of feeling like I'm being edged out." She nodded. "That's fair." They watched their youngest tumble off the jungle gym and bounce back up like nothing had happened. "Marriage is weird," Becky said suddenly. Mark snorted. "Understatement. I mean," she continued, "everyone talks about the big stuff. Cheating, money, parenting. But no one really warns you about the quiet erosion. The way things can wear down without anyone doing anything wrong." He considered that. "I think that's where the choosing comes in." "The choosing?" "Yeah," he said. "Not the wedding day choosing. The Tuesday night choosing. The do we talk about this or let it rot choosing." Becky smiled softly. "You're very poetic today. Don't get used to it." That night, after the kids were asleep, Becky pulled out a bottle of wine they'd been saving. "For what?" Mark asked. "For us," she said. "Still being married." He raised his glass. "Low bar." She clinked it. "Still choosing." They sat at the table, wine slowly disappearing, talking about things that had nothing to do with grief or conflict. Vacations they might take someday. A house project neither of them wanted to start. The possibility of a dog that didn't shed as much. "I'm glad you scared me," Becky said suddenly. Mark choked slightly. "I'm sorry." She laughed. "Not on purpose. But that night, when I realized how close I was to losing you without losing you." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I never wanted to scare you." "I know," she said. "But it reminded me that marriage isn't automatic. It's active." He squeezed her hand. "I'm here." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not panicking anymore." Later, as they got ready for bed, Mark caught his reflection and barely recognized the man who used to sit in his car watching podcasts to avoid going home. He turned off the light and joined Becky under the covers. "You happy?" she asked quietly. He thought about it. About the mess they'd lived through. About the house breathing again. About parking in the driveway. "Yes," he said. "In a very unremarkable way." She smiled into his shoulder. "Those are the best ways." As sleep pulled at him, Mark realized something else too. He wasn't waiting for things to go back to the way they were. He was choosing the way they were becoming.